The file was thick. Not physically. Cathari data had no weight, no pages. But Vale Keth had been reading for 6 hours, and the light in his study had shifted from cold white to something that tried to look warm, and he still wasn't done. Earth, 3rd planet, single star system, 1 moon. He read his own notes back to himself. Unremarkable. It was the right word. He had catalogued 41 species across 19 star systems, and Earth sat somewhere in the middle of all of them. Not the most primitive, not the most advanced, not the most anything. The kind of planet you filed correctly and moved past. He pulled up the biology section. The species called themselves humans, Homo sapiens. The name, when translated, meant something close to wise man, which Vale Keth found generous. He had met many species that gave themselves grand names. The Tyleth had called themselves the chosen of the deep current. The Tyleth were gone now. Their home planet was a refueling stop on a trade route nobody used much anymore. He started with the body. No armor. No natural weapon systems worth the name. No venom, no significant claws, no biological defense that would trouble anything larger than a mid-tier predator. The skeleton was calcium-based, brittle under enough force. The skin was thin enough that a Cathari child could damage it without trying. The eyes were fixed to a narrow band of light. They could not see in the dark, could not hear at the frequencies most predators used, could not smell at any range that mattered. They needed sleep, deep, unaware, completely helpless sleep, every single cycle without exception. Remove the sleep, and they broke down within days. Their young were useless for years after birth. Their elderly became fragile. Their sick had no fast biological pathway to repair. He made a note. Standard soft tissue species. Recommend Category 2 approach. He moved to the behavior section. The emotional system was a tangle. Fear, grief, joy, rage, shame, longing. They experienced all of it at full intensity, and had not, in however many thousands of years of existence, learned to manage the volume. They cried, in public, in front of enemies, in front of cameras they installed to watch themselves. They formed deep attachments to members of their own species, and more strangely, to other species entirely, domesticated animals mostly, which they allowed to live inside their homes, and which they appeared to genuinely grieve when those animals died. Vale Keth stared at that particular entry. Grieving for animals. He made a note. Emotional volatility. High susceptibility to psychological destabilization. Attachment bonds are a leverage point, if required. He moved to the history files. This was where the file became interesting, not in a good way, but in the way that a locked door is interesting. You notice it, you note it, you move on. Humans have been in continuous armed conflict for the entire length of their recorded history. Not occasional conflict, not resource disputes with long peaceful gaps between them. Continuous. They had been fighting each other before they had cities, before they had writing, before they had the wheel. There was not a single century on record in which some portion of the species was not engaged in organized violence against another portion of the same species. The scale changed. Sometimes it was regional. Sometimes it pulled in most of the planet at once. Twice in a single century, they had managed that. They called those events world wars, as if naming the scale of the thing helped them understand it. They fought over land, over water, over resources, over beliefs, over stories about gods none of them had ever met. They fought for reasons that, from the outside, barely passed as reasons. And then, and this was the part Vale Keth found genuinely strange, they stopped. They signed agreements. They rebuilt. They developed medicines that extended lives by decades. They produced art that other members of their species found beautiful enough to weep over. They started again. New generation, new city, new beginning. And then they fought again. He leaned back in his chair and looked at the ceiling for a moment. A species at war with itself across its entire history was not building toward anything. It was consuming itself. It would collapse inward long before any outside force needed to apply pressure. The intraspecies aggression alone would fragment any resistance. He made a note. Continuous internal conflict, strategic asset. Unified planetary defense, considered unlikely. He was close to the end of the file. The last section was physiological outliers. Standard data, variance ranges, and edge cases that lived in every xenobiology report, and almost never contained anything that changed the picture. He had written this section himself for 38 prior species, and had found nothing worth a second read in 37 of them. He almost moved past it. Some deep habit of thoroughness, the kind that Cathari education put in you before it put anything else in, made him read it. Pain tolerance outliers. The numbers were wrong. Not wrong in the sense of bad data. He checked the sourcing 3 times. It was clean, but wrong in the sense that they sat at the far edge of what a biological system was supposed to do while still functioning. The recorded cases were soldiers, athletes, accident survivors, parents under extreme stress. Individuals who had, under documented conditions, continued to move, to fight, to act, through levels of physical damage that the models said should have caused complete shutdown. Not rare, isolated freaks, a measurable, reproducible percentage of the population. He read the case files one by one. A soldier with 3 broken ribs who had carried a colleague 4 kilometers through hostile terrain. A parent who had lifted a vehicle off a child trapped beneath it. Cases involving deep lacerations, burns, significant blood loss, the body continuing past the point where the biological math said it should stop. Not for a moment, not for a burst, for sustained periods. He sat with the numbers. Then he made a note. Pain tolerance outliers, statistical noise, extreme edge cases, not representative of species average. Standard documentation, no action required. He closed the file. He opened the summary template, the document that would go to Admiral Thresh, that would become the foundation of the invasion plan, that would tell 11 warships and their crews exactly what they were walking into. And he began to type. Earth, 3rd planet, single yellow star, dominant species, Homo sapiens. Classification, soft tissue, emotionally volatile, technologically adolescent. Internal conflict patterns expected to prevent unified resistance. Recommended approach, standard 3-continent simultaneous planetfall. Expected resistance collapse, 60 to 90 days. He read it back once. Every word was accurate. The data was the data. He submitted it. Outside the viewport, the fleet moved through the dark between stars. 11 ships, each one built to end something. All of them aimed in the same direction, toward the soft planet, toward the unremarkable species with the calcium bones and the thin skin and the strange habit of mourning animals. Vale Keth should have felt settled, prepared. He usually did at this stage. The file was done. The summary was clean. He did feel that way, mostly. The pain tolerance data sat in the back of his mind, the way a loose thread sits at the edge of a garment. Small, barely there. The kind of thing you notice once and then ignore because everything else looks fine. He told himself it was nothing. He closed his eyes. Outside, the fleet kept moving. The planetfall was clean. 3 continents. Simultaneous. The ships came down through the cloud cover at 0400 local time across each landing zone, which meant most of the population was asleep, which was the point. 11 Cathari campaigns across 19 star systems had produced a very clear picture of what worked. You came in the dark. You came everywhere at once. You gave the enemy no single point to rally around, no single fire to run toward. The models said resistance would be scattered and regional for the first 72 hours. Then communication would fail. Then the governments, there were many, fractured along old lines, exactly as Vale Keth's report had predicted, would begin to conflict with each other about what to do. And then the window would open. The models were correct about 72 hours. They were not correct about anything else. Admiral Thresh received the first anomaly report 14 hours after planetfall. One of his captains, Drev San, a careful officer who did not file reports that weren't necessary, had sent a 2-line message that said, in the flat formal language of Cathari military communication, Ground Unit 7 has engaged a human resistance cell. Resistance cell is significantly undersized. Resistance cell has not retreated, awaiting further orders. Thresh read it twice. He sent back, continue engagement, report outcome. He moved to other things. 14 hours in, there were 100 small fires. This was one of them. 6 hours later, Drevsan filed again. Resistance cell has been neutralized. Casualties on our side, 4. Estimated human force engaged, 11 individuals. Note, human combatants improvised explosive devices from agricultural materials found on site. Several had no conventional weapons. One combatant continued to engage after confirmed limb injury. Recommend updated risk assessment for future ground engagements. Thresh forwarded it to Veilketh without comment. Veilketh read it in his quarters and opened his anomalies file, a folder he had created 2 hours after planetfall for things that didn't fit the model, intending to clear it out once the data settled. The folder now had 11 entries. He added a 12th. He told himself 11 anomalies in 14 hours was within the range of expected variance for a new campaign. He almost believed it. 3 days in, the communication networks went down exactly as predicted. What the prediction had not accounted for was the speed at which humans switched to older, simpler methods. Runners, low-frequency radio, hand signals, physical messengers moving on foot and on 2-wheeled vehicles through territory that Cathari aerial surveillance found difficult to cover at low altitude. The resistance did not stop communicating. It got harder to intercept. Veilketh added it to the folder. On the 5th day, Commander Sarah Okonkwo appeared on a recorded transmission that ground teams recovered from a destroyed human communications post. She was standing in front of a map. Her face was calm in the way that certain things are calm, not because nothing is happening, but because the person in the middle of it has decided that panic is a resource they cannot afford. She said 2 words. Sort it. The transmission cut. Veilketh played it back 3 times. He wasn't sure why. There was no tactical information in it. It was 2 words from a human officer to her staff. It didn't mean anything. He couldn't stop thinking about the way she stood. By the end of the first week, the pattern was visible. Not in any single engagement. Each one, looked at alone, was a Cathari win. Ground taken, human forces pushed back, infrastructure damaged. On paper, the campaign was proceeding. But the paper and the ground were starting to look different from each other. Human resistance forces were not defending. They were not standing in lines and waiting to be engaged. They were moving, constantly, unpredictably, hitting supply lines, hitting communication relays, hitting the parts of the Cathari operation that were never hardened, because no prior enemy had ever had the clarity, or the nerve, to target them. A species with no warships going after logistics. The Tyleth had tried to fight ship to ship, and lost inside a week. Humans were not trying to fight what Thresh had. They were trying to make it stop working. Thresh added more forces to the southern continent. The reports from the southern continent got worse. Veilketh's anomalies folder had 47 entries. Then the footage arrived. It came from a battlefield drone, routine surveillance, low altitude, eastern sector. The timestamp put it at midday on day 9. The quality was good enough to see detail. A human soldier, combat gear, no identifying unit markings, moving through a ruined structure. Then Cathari weapons fire. Direct hit to the upper body. The soldier went down. That was expected. That was how the biology was supposed to work. The soldier got up. Not slowly, not gradually, up, moving, back in the structure, moving toward the source of the fire, not away from it. A second hit, lower body this time. The soldier went down again. Longer pause this time. Veilketh watched the timestamp tick upward. 8 seconds. He found himself counting. The soldier got up again. Veilketh played the footage back. Then again. Then again. He watched it 11 times before he closed the file and he was not watching it for tactical information, and he knew he was not watching it for tactical information, and he closed his notes and sat in his chair and looked at the wall opposite him for a long time. The wall said nothing useful. He opened a new section in the anomalies folder. He labeled it simply Threshold. He didn't write anything in it yet. He just left it open. Outside, on 3 continents, in the dark and the dust and the ruins of things that used to be cities, humans continued to do the thing the model said they shouldn't still be doing. They got up. Every time, they got up. Vale Keth sat in his chair until the light changed, and for the first time in a career built on the clean certainty of data, he did not know what to do with what he was looking at. The data was still the data. The numbers were still the numbers. Something about the numbers had started to feel like a warning. He could not decide what it was warning him about. He went to find Thresh. 3 months. Thresh had never spent 3 months on a Category 2 campaign. Category 2 was 60 to 90 days. That was what the model said. That was what experience said. 41 species across 19 systems said it. 40 of them had been done and filed and turned into trading posts, or fuel stops, or quiet little administrative planets before the 90-day mark. He stood in the command room and looked at the map, and the map looked wrong. They held more territory than they had at planetfall. That part was correct. The lines had moved in the right direction. If you looked only at the lines, the campaign was succeeding. Thresh had learned, across 3 months on this particular planet, to stop looking only at the lines. The losses told the real story. Ship damage, personnel, equipment. At day 90 on a standard campaign, losses were a rounding error, the clean tail end of a concluded thing. Here at day 90, losses were accelerating. The daily casualty reports had gotten longer every week, not shorter. The resupply requests had doubled. He requested reinforcements from the home fleet. He used the word logistical to describe the need. He did not use the word struggling. Valeketh came to him with a folder that was by now obscene in size. Over 200 entries. He laid the broad shape of it out without drama, in the flat voice of a scientist, trying very hard to remain a scientist. The resistance had not collapsed. It had changed shape. Every time Cathari forces pushed into a region and destroyed the local resistance structure, a new structure appeared within days, built from what was left. Not the same structure, a different one, leaner, adjusted to what had just failed. The humans were not recovering. They were adapting. In real time, mid-campaign, they were updating their methods based on what wasn't working, and doing something else. Thresh listened without expression. He asked, "Is that unusual?" Valeketh said, "I have never seen it at this rate." There was a pause. "Continue monitoring," Thresh said. The supply line attacks were the problem that Thresh could not solve cleanly. The humans had no warships, no air superiority, no weapon systems that could threaten the fleet directly. What they had was a complete and detailed understanding of how a military operation needed to eat. The fuel, the food, the parts, the communication infrastructure, and a willingness to go after all of it simultaneously across 3 continents, using forces so small that standard surveillance patterns missed them. Thresh reinforced the supply lines. The humans found the gaps in the reinforcement. He closed the gaps. They found new ones. It was a conversation conducted in damage reports and rerouted logistics columns. And it was a conversation that Thresh was losing slightly more often than he was winning. He didn't say that out loud. On day 94, the report came in from the prisoner facility. A facility held 63 human captives, taken across the 3-month campaign. Standard procedure. Prisoners were a resource. Intelligence, leverage, information about resistance structure. The Cathari psychologist assigned to the facility was a thorough officer named Sorel Vyas, and she had filed weekly reports that had so far said, in essence, what the model expected. Stress responses, disorientation, compliance developing over time, information beginning to flow. The report on day 94 said something different. Sorel Vyas wrote it in the careful language of a professional who had been surprised and was trying not to show it. She had conducted standard assessments. The prisoners were showing expected physiological stress markers, but their behavior inside the facility had drifted, over 90 days, away from what the model described and towards something the model didn't have a category for. They were learning the language. Not well. None of them were fluent, but systematically. The ones who had picked up the most were teaching the others. They had mapped the facility's interior through routine movement patterns over 3 months and could describe the layout in detail, wall by wall, guard rotation by guard rotation. They organized, quietly, without any apparent signal system that surveillance had identified. They had divided responsibilities among themselves without a visible hierarchy that anyone could disrupt. One of them, a woman in the Western Bloc, had begun smiling at one of the guards. Not provocatively, not in any way that violated protocol. A specific small, entirely calm smile every time that particular guard passed. The guard had filed a request to be reassigned to a different post. He hadn't been able to explain why. He just said the smile bothered him. Sorel Vyas wrote, "They arrived as prisoners. They have spent 3 months becoming something else. I am not certain what the correct classification is. I am requesting updated assessment protocols." She appended one line at the end. "I would not describe the current population of this facility as controlled." Thresh read it. He didn't respond to it directly. He forwarded it to Veilketh and went back to the map. Veilketh read it in his quarters and did not sleep that night. He opened his research files instead. He went further back than the invasion report. Further back than Cathari's first contact with the system. Further back than any recent documentation. He pulled the deep evolutionary record. The biology of Earth across geological time. The history of its biosphere, which was long and violent, in a way that made the current conflict look like a polite disagreement. He read about the extinctions, the ice ages, the atmospheric shifts that had killed most of the life on the planet multiple times over. Each time, something survived, not by being the strongest thing, or the fastest, or the most heavily armored. By being the most adaptable, by changing faster than the change that was trying to kill it. The ones that had shared the planet with Homo sapiens for thousands of years. The ones that were bigger, or stronger, or had been there longer. All gone. One species standing. He read about the Pleistocene, the megafauna extinction, the wave of massive animals that had vanished from the planet, starting around the same time humans spread across it. Mammoths, giant ground sloths, cave bears, saber-toothed cats, things that had survived ice ages and climate shifts, and predators larger than anything alive on Earth today. All gone. He sat with that for a while. He pulled up a specific paper from the Human Scientific Archive, a study of early human hunting practices. The Cathari translation was imperfect, but the meaning was clear enough. There was a technique, used by early humans across multiple continents, for hunting prey that was larger and faster than themselves. They didn't overpower it. They didn't outrun it. They followed it. For days. They tracked it across distances that should have broken them, and didn't, because they had a cooling system, sweat-based, almost unique among large predators on their planet, that allowed them to keep moving in heat that stopped everything else. They followed the animal until it was exhausted and couldn't run anymore. Until the thing that was bigger and stronger and faster had nothing left, and then they walked up to it. Veilketh stared at his screen. He pulled up the anomalies folder. He looked at the entry he had labeled Threshold, the one he had never written anything in. The video file of the soldier who kept getting up. He understood something, sitting there in the dark of his quarters with the fleet moving overhead and the war grinding on below him on a planet that should have been done 2 months ago. He understood it the way you understand something that has been true the whole time, that you walked past 6 times, that was sitting in plain view from the beginning. He opened the entry. He started writing. He wrote for 4 hours without stopping. When he finished, he closed the folder and sat very still for a long time, in the way that a person sits still when they have just understood something they cannot ununderstand. Outside, on 3 continents, humans were still getting up. They had never stopped getting up. The briefing room on the command ship was cold, the way it was always cold, the way Cathari preferred it. A temperature that kept the mind sharp and the body just slightly uncomfortable, which was where Cathari thinking had always done its best work. Thresh sat at the head of the long table. 2 senior captains flanked him. Sorel Vias, the facility psychologist, attended by secure link from the surface. Vale Keth stood at the front of the room with a data panel behind him, and the revised catalog on every screen. He had rewritten it in 6 days. He had not slept much during those 6 days. He looked the same as he always looked, precise, composed, the expression of a man who dealt in facts and trusted facts to carry their own weight without assistance. He had been trained to present data without drama. Cathari scientists were not supposed to bring themselves into the room with their findings. He brought himself into the room anyway. He couldn't help it. There was nowhere else left to put what he was carrying. He started with the body. No armor. He pulled up the original entry, the one he had written before planetfall, the one that said soft tissue and low threat and standard category 2. He put the new entry beside it. The new entry read, no external armor. Internal structure optimized for impact absorption and rapid movement over long distances. Calcium-based skeleton, flexible under stress before fracture. Following injury, tissue repair produces denser cellular structure at the wound site than was present before damage. They do not heal to their prior state. They heal past it. He let that sit. Thresh said nothing. Vale Keth moved to the next entry. Emotional volatility. The original, significant vulnerability to psychological destabilization. The new column beside it, neurochemical systems capable, under extreme stress, of overriding pain signals, fear responses, and survival instincts. The same chemical architecture that produces grief and attachment also produces, at the upper threshold, a state in which the individual continues to function past biological shutdown signals. This is not a defect. This is a weapon the body deploys against itself to preserve group survival. He advanced the slide. Short lifespan. Original. Average lifespan brief. Limits individual contribution to civilization. New entry. Generational replacement rate produces cultural adaptation faster than biological evolution in most species. What humans cannot adapt to in one generation, they pass down as trauma, as knowledge, as drive, and the next generation arrives already shaped by what destroyed the previous one. They do not recover from catastrophe, they metabolize it. He stopped at the word metabolize because it was the right word, and it was a terrible word in this context, and he had used it anyway. Thresh's expression did not change. The captains on either side of him had gone very still. Valeketh moved to the slide he had been least looking forward to. Continuous intraspecies conflict. Original, strategic asset to Cathari campaign, expected to prevent unified resistance. He had deleted that entry entirely. The replacement was longer than anything else in the document. Humans have been in continuous armed conflict with members of their own species for the entirety of their recorded history. This was assessed as a vulnerability. It is the opposite. They have been training against opponents who know exactly how to hurt them, who speak their languages, who understand their tactics, who can predict their behavior. 10,000 years of intraspecies warfare is 10,000 years of learning, at the highest possible cost, how to fight something that is trying as hard as it can to beat you. Every species the Cathari have defeated in 11 prior campaigns came to this conflict without that preparation. Homo sapiens came to this conflict having done nothing but prepare. We were not their first enemy. We are not even their most dangerous one. We inserted ourselves into an ongoing evolutionary arms race, and we did so from below. He stopped talking. The room held the silence, the way a room holds a sound after the sound stops. Thresh looked at the screen for a long time. Then, the endurance hunting data. Vale Keth nodded. He brought up the section. He had thought about this slide more than any other in the 6 days of revision. He had rewritten it 11 times. Every version came out looking the same. Early Homo sapiens hunted prey larger and faster than themselves, using sustained pursuit. Not ambush, not superior strength, pursuit. They followed animals across distances and durations that their prey could not sustain, exploiting a thermal regulation system, sweat-based cooling, unique among the large predators of their biosphere, that allowed them to continue moving in conditions that forced everything else to stop. The prey did not lose the race. The prey ran until there was nothing left, and then it stopped, and the humans walked up to it. This is not a historical curiosity. This is the core of the species. This is what they are built for. They do not win the first fight. They win the last one. They are still here. Thresh closed his eyes for one moment. One moment. Then they were open again, and he was looking at Vale Keth with the particular expression of a man who has just been told something he had already, in the part of himself that he didn't consult for command decisions, already known. Buy the catalog, Vale Keth said. He said it the way a scientist says it at the end of a presentation. The data is the data. What you do with it is yours. He advanced to the last slide. It had one line on it. He had written it at the end of the 6 days, at the point where he had no sleep left, and the document was as honest as he knew how to make it. And there was nothing left to say, except the actual thing. We did not find a prey species. We found an apex predator mid-hunt, and inserted ourselves into the food chain below it. He left the slide up. He stepped back from the panel. He moved his hand to adjust the data chart on the side panel. He moved it slightly, then moved it back, then moved it again to the same position he had started from, because there was nothing wrong with the chart, and there had never been anything wrong with the chart, and his hands needed something to do while the rest of him waited for Thresh to say something. Thresh looked at the last slide for a long time. The captains did not speak. Sorel Vias on the secure link from the surface had not said a word for the last 15 minutes. Eventually Thresh said, "How long have they known?" Vale Keth thought about it. "I think," he said, "they have always known." The room held that too. Outside the viewport, the fleet sat in high orbit over a planet that was, at this moment, actively organizing against them, on 3 continents, in dozens of languages, through communication systems that were 3 months into learning to be invisible to Cathari surveillance. The planet had been invaded. It had not collapsed. It had gotten better at fighting. Thresh stood up. He did not call for a vote. He did not convene a tactical council. He walked to the viewport, and stood in front of it, with his hands at his sides, and his back to the room, and looked at the planet below him. He stood there for a while. No one interrupted. When he turned back around, he said 2 words. "Find Okonkwo." They found her in Lagos. Not hiding, not in a bunker, not in an underground command center beneath layers of rock and security. She was in a building with 3 standing walls and a partial roof, at a table made from a door balanced on 2 stacks of rubble, with a map spread across it, and a cold cup of something dark beside the map. 3 members of her staff stood around her. One of them had a bandage over most of his left forearm. She looked up at the camera drone when it entered the room. She did not reach for a weapon. She said, "Tell them I'll take the call." The transmission was arranged within the hour. Cathari sighed. Thresh sat in the command room, flanked by his 2 captains, and Vale Keth standing to the left, slightly behind him, where scientists stand at these things. Human side, Okonkwo sat alone in what had been a school. 3 chairs lined up in front of her, against a wall that still had a child's drawing pinned to it. A yellow sun, a house, 2 stick figures outside it. Thresh opened with terms. He had prepared the terms carefully, in language that was generous for a Cathari withdrawal offer. He had never offered terms to a Category 2 species before. He had never needed to. He presented them now in a measured tone, as a man presents something he has decided is the right thing, and has decided not to examine too closely why it feels unfamiliar. He spoke for 4 minutes. Okonkwo listened. When he finished, she reached beside her and picked up a document, printed on paper, physical, the kind of document you couldn't intercept and couldn't delete and couldn't pretend you never received. She held it up to the transmission. "Before we discuss terms," she said, "I'd like you to read this." The transmission captured it clearly enough. Vale Keth leaned in to read. It was a list. Not demands, not conditions, not counterterms. Planets. Dates, one after another in small clean print down the page. The Tyleth, the Vorath, the Saran, the Mirik. 8 other species, 11 planets spanning the Cathari's expansion history back 400 years. Each entry had a date, the date of first contact, and a second date, the date the species stopped appearing in any record. Beside each name, in the same clean print, a short description of what that species had been. Not military assessment, something else. The Tyleth had built underwater cities that humans had found records of, and spent 100 years trying to understand. The Vorath had developed a form of mathematics that human scientists called genuinely beautiful. The Saran had composed music across 7 vocal registers, all simultaneously. Small things, real things. The list ended. Below the last entry, one line. We remember all of them. Thresh looked at the document. Vale Keth watched Thresh look at it. He watched Thresh's hands during the transmission. They were on the table in front of him, flat, perfectly still, in the formal position that Cathari Command used for high-stakes contact. Correct. Expected. Everything about Thresh in that moment was what it was supposed to be. Except the stillness. Not the formal, trained stillness of a commander controlling himself. Something else. The specific stillness of a person looking at something they have no category for. An admiral who had conquered 11 species, who had a word in his language for the specific boredom of unopposed victory, sitting in front of a woman in a ruined building, in a city his fleet had bombed for 3 months, being handed a piece of paper. She knew their names, every one of them. She had had 3 months, and she had used them. I would not describe the current population of this facility as controlled, Sorel V's had written. Vale Keth thought about that. The negotiations took 11 days. They were not easy, they were not short. There were moments when they almost broke apart, twice over the withdrawal timeline, once over what access Cathari vessels would retain to the outer solar system. Okonkwo sat at her door table in the school with the child's drawing behind her, and negotiated with the precision and patience of someone who was not in a hurry, who had nothing to prove by hurrying, who understood that time was a resource she had more of than the people across the table. On the 3rd day, she brought 2 more people to the table, not military staff, a historian and a linguist. The historian's specialty was Cathari expansion records. The linguist spoke a passable amount of the Cathari trade language, and was learning more in real time. They took notes, they asked questions, they were polite and thorough and relentless. Thresh mentioned in a private communication to Vale Keth on the 5th day that he found the historian more unsettling than the military personnel. Vale Keth did not find this surprising. The withdrawal agreement was signed on day 11. The terms were not what Thresh had originally offered. They were not humiliating. Okonkwo had not gone for humiliation, which was a choice that Vale Keth spent a long time thinking about afterward. She had gone for specific. Precise. Every clause had a mechanism. Every mechanism had a verification path. The document was not written by someone who trusted goodwill. It was written by someone who had spent a long time learning what happened when goodwill was all you had. The fleet repositioned. There was no announcement to the crew about the nature of the repositioning. The orders simply came down through the proper channels, in the proper language, routed through the proper command structure. The fleet moved. On Earth, the news reached people in different ways, at different times. In the ruins of cities and in the fields where people had been hiding, and in the hospitals running on 1/3 capacity, and in the schools with 3 walls, and in all the other places where the species had spent 3 months doing what the species always did, adjusting, continuing, refusing to arrive at the conclusion that they were supposed to arrive at. Some of them cried. Some of them celebrated in the streets, which had not been safe for months, and were standing in them anyway. Okonkwo stood on a rooftop in Lagos as the last Cathari ships climbed out of the atmosphere, visible in the pre-dawn sky as moving points of light, growing smaller. She watched until she couldn't see them anymore. She did not celebrate. Her city was still in ruins. Her people were still hungry, still hurt, still carrying 3 months of damage that would take years to undo. There was no clean end here, no moment where the weight lifted and everything reset to the way it was. There was just the next thing. There was always just the next thing. She said 2 words to the dark. Sort it. She went back down to the table. Vale Keth filed his final addendum to the catalog 9 days after the withdrawal. It was classified above Admiral clearance, not because it contained tactical information, because it contained something harder to handle than tactical information. It was 1 paragraph. The defining characteristic of Terran apex predators is not strength, speed, or biological advantage. It is persistence. They do not end the hunt. They do not reassess at the threshold of pain. They do not stop. In 11 prior campaigns, we have never encountered a species that lacked, at some deep level, the capacity to accept that it had lost. Homo sapiens do not appear to possess this capacity. We searched for it across 3 months of direct engagement and across the full evolutionary record. It is not there. What is there, in its place, is something the catalog does not have a word for. The complete biological and psychological refusal of the finality of defeat. They do not survive hardship. They become the next version of themselves that whoever comes after them will have to contend with. He paused at the end of that paragraph for a long time. Then he typed the classification update at the bottom of the file. Homo sapiens, revised classification, not prey, not standard predator. He looked at the cursor. He typed the last word. Apex. Then, below it, in the small italicized notation field that nobody read, in the space reserved for supplementary observations, note, they already knew. He closed the file. Outside, the stars were the same as they had always been. The dark between them was the same dark. Somewhere in that dark, a planet was rebuilding itself, was feeding its hungry, and treating its injured, and arguing about what had happened, and what it meant, and what came next. A species with calcium bones and thin skin, and a long, unbroken habit of standing back up, was doing what it always did. Getting up. Already becoming the next thing it would need to be.